The sad point is that too often economic globalization has interfered with the benefits of the kinds of globalization, of these other benefits. For instance, one of the things that happened in the last round of the trade negotiations was that there was strengthening intellectual property. Intellectual property are patents, copyrights, important to provide incentives for innovators, writers, creative people, to engage in their creative activity. Everybody recognizes the importance of intellectual property. But one has to get a balanced intellectual property regime that recognizes the rights, the benefits, and the costs. The rights and benefits to users, to researchers, the cost that can result from monopoly that is often associated with excessively strong intellectual property rights. One of the consequences of the intellectual property provision of the Uruguay round, which is called TRIPS, was that it made it more difficult for those in developing countries to have access to generic medicines. And the result of that was that the price of medicines rose enormously. In effect, when they signed the agreement on the Uruguay round in Marrakesh in 1994, they were signing the death warrants for hundreds of thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the developing countries. Because at the higher prices that resulted from those provisions, the fact that generic medicines would not be available, most of the people in those countries would not be able to afford life-saving medicines, for instance, for AIDS. Just to give you a picture of the magnitude of what we're talking about, a year's worth of prescriptions for AIDS medicines in the United States costs around $10,000. It costs under $300 to produce these medicines. Generic producers can make them available for under $300. And yet, under the intellectual property provisions, where producers in South Africa and Brazil could not make them available at these costs. At $10,000, people living on $500 a year cannot afford those prices. That's an example of where globalization has failed. It has put economic values, the profits of multinational pharmaceutical companies, above the interest, above the other values, including the value of life itself. And that's just one example of values which have been given short shrift in the globalization debate. The environment has often been destroyed. I believe that if we make globalization work in the right way, we can actually make it a force for preserving the environment. But the way it's often been managed in the past, it has led to the destruction of the environment. So these are some of the examples, some of the ways, some of the reasons that there is discontent, such discontent with globalization. Yes, it has the power to produce enormous benefits, to raise living standards, to provide medicines, but too often it has not lived up to those promises. It's not produced growth, it's not produced stability, it's not reduced poverty in many countries of the world, and it has put in jeopardy other values that are of enormous consequence. Now that leads to the natural question, why has globalization failed? It has enormous potential benefit, but so often it has not lived up to that potential. And in my mind, there is a single reason, and that is that economic globalization has outpaced political globalization. Globalization means the closer integration of the countries of the world. There's been a lowering of transportation costs, of communication costs, elimination of many of the man-made barriers to movements of goods and services, capital, even labor in some cases, across boundaries. But that closer integration means that we're more interdependent. When we're more interdependent, we need to act together. We need to act cooperatively. 150 years ago, a similar process was in play. The formation of the nation state. Transportation costs were coming down, communication costs were coming down, and national units were being created. But then we had the nation state that could regulate, that could make nation building work, to make sure that these enormous economic forces work to the benefit of all the citizens of the country. Today, we don't have that kind of overarching political process. We have, in a way, forms of political interaction that are very flawed. And the result of this is that there is a democratic deficit at the global level. And that means the decisions that are made at the global level do not reflect the interest, the well-being of all the citizens of the world. Too often this democratic deficit results in the interest, well-being of corporations, special interests, dominating over those of ordinary citizens all over the world. In fact, it's not just a matter of the developing countries versus the developed countries. Quite often the citizens of the developed countries suffer as well. It is really a question of special interest and corporate interest against the well-being of citizens all over the world. I mentioned, for instance, before the importance of agricultural subsidies and the way that they depressed prices. The farmers all over the world, developing countries, receive. Those subsidies cost taxpayers in the developed countries enormous amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars every year. So the citizens of these countries are paying an enormous price to benefit a very small number of corporations. In the United States, the benefits of these huge subsidies go to a relatively small fraction of the farmers. Only 2% of Americans actually work in farming, but the fraction of those who get the benefits are very small fraction of the money goes to the small farmer. Most of the money goes to huge corporate farmers. For instance, in the area of cotton, 25,000 very well-off American cotton farmers divide amongst themselves $3 to $4 billion a year. And the result of this is to depress the price of cotton, damaging the livelihood of some 10 million poor subsistence cotton farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. I should make clear that the United States is not the only guilty party in terms of agricultural subsidies. The subsidies from Europe are actually larger than those of America. Japan, all the advanced industrial countries have problems with subsidies. Europe complains that the United States has actually doubled its subsidies after the end of the Uruguay round when it promised to reduce. The United States complains that European subsidies are so much larger. Europe complains that America's subsidies are focused on producers and production. America complains that Europe subsidizes exports. They spend almost enormous amount of energy blaming each other. If they spent that same time dealing with the problem, the world would be a lot better off. Take the case of the European cow, which has got an enormous amount of notoriety. The average cow in Europe today receives a subsidy of close to $2 a day. That's a number that resonates because the World Bank defines poverty as living under $2 a day. 40% of the people in the world live on less than $2 a day. It is better to be a cow in Europe than to be an average person in the developing world. One of the reasons that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the United States and Mexico, was such a failure, did not live up to the expectation, was that the poorest people in Mexico were actually made poorer, because the poorest people in Mexico were the corn farmers. Eke out a bare living, producing corn, selling a little bit. The result of joining NAFTA, joining with the United States, was that American corn, highly subsidized corn, was allowed into Mexico, and the price of corn fell by 50%. Obviously, some people in the city were better off, but those who depended for their livelihood on corn, producing corn, were made much worse off, and the rural poverty, as a result, increased. "20 years ago, when the current era of globalization began, there was a certain set of doctrines, certain set of beliefs. The belief was that liberalizing trade, taking away trade barriers, would lead to more trade would lead to more growth would lead everybody to be better off, both in developed and less developed countries. Each one of those hypotheses, assumptions, has now been questioned.